Hello and welcome back to the Comic Literate Podcast, the podcast that does deep dives into the best and worst and middest of comic books, graphic novels, and mangas.
Not there yet, is it?
It's workshopping. I'm your host, the soon-to-be known as Comic Stan, and with me, as always, is my nostalgic co-host, it's Jamie.
Hello, mate. How are you?
I'm not too bad. I mean, we've got I'm more excited for this episode because it's right in my wheelhouse, as you know.
Isn't it?
It's right to the roots of the Comic Literate ethos, is that a word? Ethos, yeah.
It's both right up your alley and right up my alley because I like old things.
You like sitting in, just having books in the room that by today's standards, that is old, isn't it?
Yeah.
Some kids don't know what a book is and have never touched one.
Yeah, we're sat in a room full of books and vinyl records, like.
There was a thing where, what was it, some famous British radio host died relatively recently, like a couple of months ago. And I unfortunately can't remember his name, which is unfortunate, but I remember that because someone posted on a British subreddit or something. They were like, I had to explain who this person was, and basically we agreed that radio used to be a free form of podcast. Like, having to reframe it, it's like, this is why this person was famous.
It's like a podcast, but it's always on, and you listen to it in the car for some reason.
And you can't choose you can choose which channel you're listening to, but you can't choose what's playing on it.
I love that even now you're using modern terminology because it's a radio station, not a radio channel.
I mean, imagine explain to our kids what VHS tapes are, and by extension, DVDs.
Imagine, I saw somebody trying to explain what a cassette tape was to, maybe a 13-year-old a couple years ago. And he had a set of headphones, and he was like, where does the headphone jack go if it plays music? And what's funny now is that headphone jacks aren't even a thing anymore.
Depending on the brand, that's a real Apple bullshit move they made, where they were like...
I mean, in fairness, my Oppo doesn't have a headphone jack in it.
Actually... No, mine does. My Samsung does. So, it depends on the brand, doesn't it?
Right.
It's a modern subject of contention, isn't it? Like whether they should have one or not. But I think yes, but maybe that is the old version of listening to things now.
Right. So I have a friend who's an audiophile. And
really emphasize the audio part of that.
Yeah, he's an audiophile. Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I get it. That suffix has had some bad rap, hasn't it?
It's kind of been co-opted.
There's one particular type of file that's particularly disliked.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I was trying to think of another file that you could be that wasn't paedophile, and I was going to make a joke there, but my brain just didn't move fast enough for me.
Bibliophile? People who love bibs?
No, that's paedophiles, mate. I'm sorry. For our American listeners, a bib is the thing you put on a baby so they don't dribble on their clothes. I believe they call it
I think they call them bibs as well.
No, they call it Americans have a different name for it.
Are you sure you're not thinking of pacifier and diapers? Because those are their names for those. Whereas we call them dummies and nappies, because apparently if it's baby, we have to add a Y at the end for some reason.
Yeah, it's got to be cute.
Yeah.
American name. Oh, if I keep talking, you won't cut it out. For
you can't guarantee that.
Bib. No, I accidentally Googled bin.
Trash can.
Do you know, I think you're fucking right. I think they do call it a bib.
I think you were kind of crossed wires because, again, of the pacifier diaper scenario.
So anyway, he's a paedophile.
Who are we talking about?
He's an audiophile, and he has started to... He carries a cassette Walkman with him with a handful of cassettes in his rucksack, and that's how he listens to music on the go. And he loves it because he gets a warm analog music sound when he's out for a jog or whatever.
It's the handheld vinyl, I'm guessing.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah. I mean, sorry, you remember cassette tapes, right?
Yeah, I know what you mean by cassette tape.
Because for a minute I was like, you're just going, oh, so it's like handheld vinyl. I'm like, wait a minute, you are from the 90s. So, do you not remember cassette tapes, Ryan?
By which I mean, allow me to elaborate.
Right, okay.
By which I mean, it's like the larger... non-personalized version of the vinyl because it's a very unique style of sound. Because the vinyl is unique to vinyl. So I'm assuming the cassette, because it's been decades since I've listened to a cassette. I'm assuming the cassette has its own signature sound. No, so it's not the best quality, but it's a unique sound that people enjoy.
Yeah, it sounds like tape.
And that's what I meant by the handheld vinyl.
Totally. No, I see exactly where you're coming from. Yeah, so he listens to cassettes on the go.
Right.
Anyway, I'm so sorry. We had a tangent from a tangent.
It was a tangent on a tangent. It's tangents all the way.
It's Inception.
Yes.
Dreams all the way
tangent
down,
within
baby.
a tangent within a tangent, yeah.
Where's my spinning top? Where's my spinning top?
That'll be the 100th episode where you have to do 100 tangents. So we have to like start from one subject and we have to like keep tangenting 100 times.
Don't threaten me with a good time.
But we also need someone to counter it, because if we count, it's going to interrupt the flow of the tangents.
Well, no, because the tangents then the counting becomes a tangent in and of itself, which means you only need to do 50 tangents deep because you count each one.
Yeah, but is talking about the time a tangent? Like if I was like, wait, what time is it? We'd be like, he went on a tangent about the time.
Yeah,
like,
maybe not.
I wouldn't quite. If we went on an actual tangent about time, then that would count.
About Time is a great film.
Yeah. So my favorite time travel I've put myself on a spot here by asking a question that no one asked for.
There's only one true time travel film.
See, for me, no, we're going to have different answers, I can tell. So for me, this is a quite like nerdy answer. It's a film called Primer. Have you ever heard of it?
Yeah.
Primer is like class making time travel as boring and mundane as possible, while still and being complicated and having to pay attention. But then when the reveals happen, you go, if you've not paid attention, you go, I don't know what just happened there. But if you have paid attention, you go, holy shit, like what the fuck? And people are like, what just happened?
It's obviously Back to the Future, Ryan. I'm sorry. It
like
is.
that is the common answer. Mine is a hipster answer.
As we know, Ryan, on this podcast, I do represent the common man.
Yes, you are a very common man, because you're wearing a tweed suit like the other episode.
Look, right? That was my business suit. I was doing business stuff. I was doing a business. I don't remember what I was doing, but I was doing something important that day.
I can't help if I'm part of the cultural elite. Anyway.
That's only funny to me because I know that I'm most definitely not part of the cultural elite.
And neither am I, but it's funny on all fronts. And if for anyone listening, if you weren't laughing, we've just explained why it's funny, so now you can laugh.
There you go.
That's how jokes work.
So we're going to have a little break so they can have a little laugh.
I'm going to edit in 10 minutes of break.
But only saying you're going to do that after they've had 10 minutes of silence.
Yeah, where they've sped through going, what the fuck's happening? Is it broken?
God, imagine having 10 full minutes of silence in 2023.
I think I'd go insane.
What the fuck would you do with that time?
I'd go insane. I think I'd spend that time going insane.
Because my phone, if my phone dies and I plug it in, it automatically turns itself back on. Like in my phone is like, I know you don't want me to be off.
Yes. Funny that how like the machines that try and capture our attention at every time are like, no, we're still on. Don't worry.
Don't worry. No. As soon as I'm plugged in, baby boy.
We say that as creators of content where we depend on people giving us their time. Yeah. And thank you for giving us your time if you're listening right now, because time is the most precious resource.
And I do feel guilty for having wasted 13 minutes of their time. So I think we should probably jump into the topic of the episode.
I was going to say, if it's your first episode, you might be like a bit like, why have they taken so long to get to? If you've listened before, you know what's going on.
I like to treat the podcast like a Swiss business meeting.
You're waiting for a prompt, but like...
Well, yeah,
I'm waiting for you to finish.
I'm waiting for you to go, what do they do in Swiss business meetings, Jamie?
Is this the old American, like, it's so hot outside. How hot is it?
Yeah, this is it. Yeah, I wanted some...
Okay. How is it like a Swiss business meeting?
There's an expectation that you have 10 minutes of chit-chat before you get down to business. It's considered impolite to go into a Swiss meeting room and get straight into business. They expect like 10 minutes of just like, how is your journey here, sir? Like before then you tell them that you want them to hide all your money from the American IRS.
Well, by that logic, we should have a massive Swiss following, but I don't think it's panned out that way yet. We've not broken through yet, is the thing. So
any Swiss followers, reach out.
Let us know if you've enjoyed this idle chit-chat before we get started. So, now we are getting started. I did refer to Jamie at the beginning as nostalgic, and I don't think you didn't question that much because I think we're all a bit nostalgic in a way.
I'm deeply nostalgic.
And we're kind of doing a nostalgic deep dive while jumping back to the future, eh? That was by accident. But if you've seen the title, you know what we're doing is we're doing a kind of point start to point end of Superman and Batman, the biggest names in comics.
Who, sorry? So,
up the top, if this is your first episode where we've done either of those people, Batman, Superman, or Spider-Man, I apologize in advance because what you are going to get is a run into the ground joke by which Jamie intentionally mispronounces the names.
No, I pronounced them correctly. It's Mr. Batman and Mr. Superman.
There was a thing didn't I send you a thing where I was like, here's why it shouldn't be that way. I think it's the hyphen in Spider-Man. So I think it's why they hyphenated Spider-Man.
Yeah, no, Spider-Man stands.
Yeah.
And I often don't call him Spider-Man.
Right.
But it's Batman. I'm sorry, it's just Batman. That's just how it works.
If we're going by the original, it's the Batman.
It's the Batman.
But does it work with the? Because you don't say the and then like a surname, do you? You can say Mr. Batman.
Yeah. Okay. So,
but they did drop the. So that's the problem.
When we're talking about 1939 Batman, he's the Batman.
The Batman.
And when we're talking about modern Batman, he becomes Batman, and that is how I'm going to differentiate for the rest of the episode.
Like I said, I apologize in advance.
Ryan doesn't like this joke. It amuses me endlessly.
So the way it works is, I think a lot of people have this. I have my versions of that. Like, I will intentionally misgrammaticize sentences and stuff like that. But
grammaticize?
It's a word I made up. It's trending.
Trending? Is it trending on X? There have been a lot of X's about it.
I kind of personalized the grammatization of that sentence just then, didn't I? Yeah. And I have my things of that. Those are your things. When someone else's thing, you're like, ugh. But when I do it myself, I'm like, come on, this is funny. So that's how it works, isn't it? So,
do you know what the best bit is? I don't even think I came up with that joke.
Was it from Friends when they were talking about a character whose name was Goldman? And they were like, what does Goldman do?
No, I'm super confident that the first time I heard that was that we went to school with doing it. Obviously, you're going to bleep the name out.
Sure, can do.
It's somebody that we went to school with, and I was hanging out with them in my 20s, and we all started doing it, and it was funny.
Right.
So I think I do owe him a writer's credit for that joke.
While also bleeping his name out.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Because obviously that guy doesn't need to be like, oh, some fucking dudes I went to school with have been talking about me on a podcast. That's a bit weird.
About a thing that I don't remember at all.
Because it happened 10 years ago.
So in advance, there's going to be a lot of that if you're wondering. So the two biggest names in superheroes, the oldest.
Do you think they're the biggest names?
Oh, for sure. Now, yeah. Like,
do you not think Spider-Man has overtaken them?
You can make an argument for it. Like, absolutely. They're, like, collectively, they are the top three. Like, no one else is in that top three league.
Yeah, except for maybe post-MCU Iron Man.
No, I wouldn't even. I think Superman, Batman, and Spider-Man are cultural, like, touchstones. Like, it's weird if people don't know
you
who
don't
they are.
See grown men in Iron Man pajamas, but a grown man in Batman pajamas, you're just like, yeah, that's a thing.
That's a weird example to go by. Like,
I think it's a perfect analogy.
I'll put it this way. I think if you did a poll of how many people recognized each name, like if you took like 20 superhero names, yeah, logo or name or whatever, I think you would have, out of 100, like 99 would know those three. And then like the tier after that would be like your MCU populars, X-Men, the Hulk, like those ones would be the next level, but they are the trinity of the superheroes.
Yeah, they kind of are, aren't they?
So, and maybe there's arguments for including some others in there, but I think collectively, like that's the kind of agreed upon. Like, I mean, merch and sales alone, like those are the three tops easily.
You can't walk in a Primark without seeing something Batman or Superman, can you?
Yeah, and it's been that way for even well before the MCU popularity.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of the measure we're going by. And because Batman and Superman are significantly older than Spider-Man, I think that's what drew us to kind of think, and they actually, as we found out, were created very close to each other in terms of time. So chronologically, they are very similar ages, while also being the two oldest.
Yeah.
So we thought, let's have a look at their first appearances and the kind of comic scene at the not so much the larger scene, but like the actual comic that they came in, what that tells us about the scene at the time and everything. And then just jump straight to modern day. So we've just found one comic each from released both from this year. I think one was from February and one was from like this month.
Yeah.
So we're jumping right from birth to modern day. Like, just let's have a look at both, see how they've changed. I think there's going to be a lot of confusing stuff in the modern ones that I was going to give you some input on.
And to be honest with you, I didn't really follow the stories of either of the comics super closely. What I was looking for was stylistic differences and differences in the way that the stories progressed and differences in the character themselves. So I was really reading with an eye towards character and not towards story.
So I know exactly what you mean. I when reading, I thought I'm not going to review or look at this the same way as we normally do a title. But I did look a little closer at the story because there were some themes that made me think, oh, this is like this is where we are right now with the character, like what kind of stories they're telling with them. So we'll get into that. Like, first question we have to address, what kind of format do we go in? Do we go both old ones and then both new ones? Or do we go Batman old, Batman new, Superman old, Superman new, or vice versa?
Let's start in the late 30s.
Okay.
We'll talk about the late 30s and then we'll talk about the early 20s.
Okay.
We'll do it that way.
Okay, fair
90
enough.
years apart. So,
should we start with the very first Action Comics #1?
Yeah, Action Comics #1, dude. And obviously we weren't reading original copies of this. We were reading
Absolutely
scans.
not. No, because that would cost upwards of £1 million, something like that.
I imagine the first appearance of Superman would be worth a lot of money.
So I've got it here. So the last sale on August 24th, 2014, a copy graded 9 by CGC. So grades of mint condition comic books. 9 is like the top level, I guess you could go.
No.
Really? So it was a 10? So the best one is a 9, which tells you something in itself.
Yeah, I know about this because of card grading.
Right.
A Gem Mint 10 is pack fresh.
Right. Yeah, so for a comic that is, do some quick maths here.
Nearly 100 years old.
Nearly 100 years. Let's work out. 8, 7, 15... 85 years old. So an 85-year-old comic, the best they could do is a grade 9.
Which is incredibly impressive.
Impressive because the comics at that time, the entire function of them, and for decades after, was buy it, read it, chuck it. That was what they were for.
Yeah, they were transitory.
So the fact that there's a whole thing with collector's items being that cross-section of things that people care about now, but no one gave a shit about at the time, and that's what leads to limited resource and it being valued so highly. So this was sold in 2014 on eBay, surprisingly, for $3,207,852 US.
Which I get. If you've got $3 million kicking about that you can spend however you want, the first appearance of Superman, pretty good place to spend that money, I'd say.
It was the first comic to have sold for more than 3 million. So there was already a bar there of just under 3 mil. And obviously, as they've got less and less or restricted supply, they've obviously just increased in value.
And I imagine there'll be some early Stan Lee signed stuff that would go for a pretty penny. But I would say in terms of collectible comic books, I would imagine the first appearance of Superman or Batman would be the absolute upper echelon that we're ever going to see of collectible comic books.
So the format, the first notable thing of this is the format of this is entirely different to comics today because it's an anthology of stories.
Yeah, I know, right? You didn't, for the purpose of today, neither of us read any of the other stories, did we?
I had a closer glance through one of them, which I'll get into why in a bit.
But the first time I read Action Comics 1, I did sit and read the whole thing.
Right.
And the cowboy stories were great. I wish cowboy comics had stayed a thing. And, Marvel and DC both had huge runs of westerns because they were fun.
Well, there's a big thing now about how people are saying that the superhero genre is going to go the way of the western because western films were extremely popular for the 60s, 70s, and maybe 80s?
60s and 70s.
Most 60s, 70s, and then just kind of died off. So people are theorizing that superheroes could go the same way. But whereas I'm more of the mind, and I think a lot of people are similar as well, I think it's just now a genre. I think it's I don't think it's going to die like westerns. I think it's just going to be a genre that is a bit more malleable than a western. I think a western is a little more rigid in what it has to be a western. Superhero, we've already seen, can go quite a bit of a way.
In fairness, though, I think what's interesting is that a lot of the conventions of the western came to define the way that the MCU would look in a roundabout way.
Yeah.
Through Star Wars. Because Star Wars was a spaghetti western set in space.
A spaghetti western space opera.
Yeah, it was a spaghetti western set to the backdrop of space. And I would argue that the way the Star Wars films looked and felt really defined what a cosmic action thriller could look like. And obviously the MCU really did become a cosmic action thriller. And so it does have some of the conventions of a spaghetti western.
Yeah.
And so I think what's happening right now in comic book films is going to be influential in cinema for the next 100 years.
Oh, definitely.
I think the MCU, I think we're seeing some of the conventions of the MCU trickle down into other action films. Action films look different now than they did before the MCU.
Been referred to as the Marvelization of cinema.
Yeah,
it's a big
100%.
topic now.
And so I agree with you. I think it's likely that actually we're going to see the actual superhero genre itself drop off a little bit, but it's left its mark on cinema. It's left its mark on modern cinema.
I think he'll always be about to an extent because, again, like I said, Westerns are quite rigid, whereas with the superhero genre, you might not have the traditional person gets powers or suit or whatever, and then there's a villain and they have to beat the villain and win the day. I think it's going to extend to like any kind of content that has powers, for example, or someone like it's going to, I think, merge more with action.
Yeah.
But superhero action, I think, is going to be a class in itself where it's going to be such a wide genre where, like, if anyone has powers or anything, that just gets put to superhero, but they don't have to beat an enemy or a villain or stuff like that. I think that's the way it's going to go. I think it's going to get watered down, but I don't think it's going to disappear as much as like Western and disco did, you know?
Disco, man. Disco never died.
The only reason people have to say that is because it died. If something didn't die, you wouldn't have a bunch of people, it's not dead, it's not dead.
Disco's great. I love disco.
No one's saying about anything else.
Yeah, you're not bopping to Chic in a nightclub, are you?
Put it this way, what are the other things that gets said about? Elvis. Almost certainly dead.
Definitely shot himself to death on the toilet.
Yes. So, again, Action Comics, a great place to start in terms of like superhero history, arguably the start of superhero history. I think there might have been superheroes like around that like may have happened before or after, but it feels like Superman kind of hit like a zeitgeist of like being very moral and, you know, righteous and appealing to the time, where there's very nationalistic kind of sensibility.
Yeah, I think what interested me most about this very early iteration of Superman is that he's a bit more aggressive.
Yes, yeah.
And his moral compass is a little bit less rigid than we've come to expect from Superman. He is, I think he is a more rugged ideal of the all-American hero. He's an all-American hero that hasn't quite been sanitized for the American right yet. And I think what really interested me about these two early comics, and you know, I'm going to talk about Batman a little bit now, but we can talk about Batman properly in a minute, is that the Batman stuff was a bit more campy and kitschy, and Batman was a little bit more sanitized. Superman was a bit more gritty. And actually, we've seen that flip, reverse, and change through the revolution into the 21st century. And now Batman is considered the kind of grittier of the two, and Superman is the kind of safer option almost. Like Superman's almost had his fangs taken out a little bit.
Well, I think it's fair to say that any character that lasts any amount of time, there's always going to be notable differences between how they started and how they kind of found their footing later on. And these characters especially have changed a lot in every decade, I would say. They've obviously built up these conventions and stuff that apply to their specific characters.
We're talking about two specific snapshots. What we're not talking about is all the iterations in between.
Yeah.
Because
literally 8 decades in between.
Yeah, because there's definitely, like, they definitely camped Batman up for, like, the Adam West era Batman. And, you know, in the 1960s, Adam West, it was all very kitsch and very campy. And then it became really gritty in the 80s and 90s with, like, Alan Moore's famous Batman run.
And Tim Burton with the films.
Yeah, absolutely. And so these characters have been through so many iterations, but I thought it would be really interesting to just bookend it and say, well, this is what we got originally and this is what we get now.
Yeah.
And so this is never going to be a full rundown of the evolution of Batman and Superman.
That's going to be the 6-hour video we add to the channel in a few years'
time.
Well,
it would take that long, wouldn't it? Like, to run through all of the iterations these characters have been through would take us hours, and it would take hundreds of hours of reading.
If you're challenging me to read hundreds of hours of comic books, I guess I'll just have to.
Dude, can you imagine plugging through all of the Batman runs from like the 50s and 60s?
Impossible. Like, I think at best you would have to just take like snapshots from each year.
Yeah.
And be like, okay, so these are a couple of issues from 1972, a couple of issues 1973. Like, you just have to kind of go through like that.
But even that would be a huge undertaking, and I think you'd be selling yourself short. Like, I think to actually do it, you just need to read all of it.
I mean, someone out there has. And if you're listening, give us a shout.
Yeah, because we would love to pick your brains about some stuff.
So right off the top, I think, again, what's interesting is because it's an anthology, obviously there's a lot of creators in this, like, this actual full comic. So all I've got here is notably the creators of Superman. So the writer and artist is Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. So they are credited with, creating Superman for this comic. What's interesting is I did find that originally he wasn't even meant to be in the first issue. It was a last minute kind of like, oh shit, we need something. And I think I read somewhere that they were kind of like, ooh, superheroes is a thing. Like, let's do a superhero one. And again, just Superman just caught on. And I think superheroes before Superman, Superman became the template. So
right.
A clear idea is like, don't they have the specific example, but I noticed, again, not jumping too ahead, but in the Batman one, there was another superhero in that Detective Comics issue.
Yes, there wasn't there?
So superheroes at that point, I think, were like anyone who might have been masked and maybe had powers, maybe not, but anyone, vigilanteism, I think, was just before superheroes. Because even before then, you had like Zorro, which is a big influence on Batman. So you had those kind of superheroes and the Shadow and like early ones like that.
So one of the things that really struck me about this early Superman is that he was involving himself in low-level street crime in a way that you'd expect from like the Punisher or Daredevil or Spider-Man. That really isn't the Superman that we know now. Superman is not kicking someone's door down to beat somebody up for domestic violence. Also, trigger warning, domestic violence. Like, they went there. They sent that.
I mean, that was a point of the story, and I think at that point it was just like, it was a thing that wasn't spoken as hushed tones, but unfortunately, it wasn't considered as serious at the time. Like, that's the problem.
Well, this is what surprised me about it, is that it was even considered an issue.
One example, I was just doing a quick Google, another big example of early superheroes is the Green Hornet, who started as a radio show or radio play. So he started in the 30s as well, with a radio debut. And so there were superheroes who were just masked vigilantes before Superman, was the point I was going to make. But in terms of the stories of Superman story in Action Comics, I was genuinely shocked by what he was doing.
Yeah.
If you would ask me, before reading it, if you would ask me to guess what kind of thing he'd be doing, I would have been like, foiled a bank robbery, saved a woman who was tied to the train tracks, saved a plane that was falling out of the sky, like classics, like really early classics of Superman. I would not in a million years have guessed that he was knocking on the door of the mayor or the governor.
The governor.
Being like, you've got this woman on death row. I've got a signed confession from proving she didn't do it. It's like, what are you, fucking Ally McBeal? Like, what is this?
It was surprising, wasn't it?
Never would have guessed that this was his superhero journey.
There was an undercurrent theme of respect for women, though, right? Like, so there were three main story beats in that first story. One of them was him saving a woman from death row. The second was him rescuing a woman from a domestic violence instance. And the third was him beating up a bunch of blokes who tried to kidnap Lois Lane.
Well, there's a fourth one as well, which you're going to get into, which is very surprising. But let's cover those first three.
Yeah.
So the first one, he has already broken the woman out of prison, it seems. I couldn't quite tell.
Yeah, and then he goes and then
carries her straight to the mayor's, whoever's mansion. It's like, right, wait here. I'm going to get you released. Isn't that what he does?
No. So he goes to the mayor because then the mayor calls death row and you see her begging for her life on death row. So the governor physically calls the death row off, like the govs on death row.
He was carrying a woman to the mansion.
Was he?
I've got to double check this because I was confused. I was hoping you were going to know.
We did very diligent work here.
I'll edit it to make it seem like we knew immediately.
Oh, what a legend.
So yeah, he's carrying a woman who's tied up with a thing around her mouth, like a scarf or bandana or something around, and he literally is like, the governor's estate finally is reached. And he's like, make yourself comfortable. I haven't time to attend to it. What?
Oh, yeah, no, you're so right.
So he's just carrying a woman. It's not even addressed if this is the woman who he is there to exonerate or not.
Yeah, I mean, it could be the person that he's caught who actually did the murder.
It could be. And it's not addressed.
No, there's plot holes here, aren't there?
Or for the first superhero story, they might have just fallen through the cracks a little bit.
I mean, I really loved this panel where he's got the governor's manservant and he's holding him over his head, but he's just holding them by the belt of his dressing gown. And I'm looking at it going, that would be quite easy to escape from.
I mean,
like
depends how strong a grip.
If you've ever tried to keep a dressing gown on, you'd know that they're not known for being a sturdy garment, are they?
But it does look like he's holding it at the front, so that's at the tie. Like,
yeah,
where
I suppose it is, isn't it?
He could be literally holding the lock piece of the dressing gown to hold it still. There's definitely a feeling here, which I think is the spawn of the superhero genre, which is injustice and having this power to fight against it to save innocent people.
Did you notice the key thing that he doesn't do yet?
He doesn't. Well, there's a lot of key things.
He doesn't fly.
Yes, I did make a note of that.
He can jump really far.
Yeah,
not fly.
It's weird seeing him not fly, and he just jumps over. And what's weird as well is they go really specific in
the
how
ant
his
and the
powers.
crickets.
Well, they literally go, he's proportionally stronger than an ant and proportionally can jump higher than grasshoppers. And it's like, that was really specific way of being like, he's really strong and can jump far.
Yeah, I suppose they needed people to suspend their disbelief, didn't they?
But they also specifically say he can leap 1/8 of a mile. Like,
which isn't that far.
No, and I get, like, by comparison, like, he got stronger as he went on because he became more fantastical as superhero.
Creep.
Yeah, but it's so specific. If they're just like he can run faster than a express train, which later became like a speeding train, which then later became a speeding bullet. So they extended where he could run faster then. Saying he's faster than an express train, fair enough. Like, at that time, everyone would have been like, wow, express trains are really fast. So imagine someone running faster than that. That's crazy.
And I love
the way they're like 1/8 a mile. Like, why?
Somebody agonized over that number.
So I was like 1/6. Like, no, don't be ridiculous. Like, calm it down. 1/9. Come on.
A little bit more than that. That's not enough. You'd never get over the building.
Just keeps turning it down 1/7 or 1/9. I feel like you want us to say 1/8. I feel like that's where you're getting us to.
I love that also his skin can't be pierced by anything less than a shrapnel from a mortar.
So they said a bursting shell. So nothing less than a bursting shell could penetrate his skin. And again, I assume that was maybe a common thing at the time, like the express train, that people are like, oh, that's a good measure of whatever. It is weird that they were just, it seemed like maybe it was too unrelatable if he was too powerful at that time. Like,
yeah.
If they were like, he can fly and super speed, it's like speed of sound and nothing can, because, he's bulletproof. People would have been like,
Superman is a literal god now.
Yeah, like, 100%.
Like, very godlike. A shell would have been a very recognizable thing for
like a mortar shell?
Yeah.
Right.
And you think this is the late 1930s, we're just going into World War II. A lot of the audience here would have either survived the Great War or had parents who survived the Great War. So a shell would be,
or as they called it at the time, World War One.
I very specifically used the right term.
That's what made me think it was, why are you saying one?
And so, I imagine, like, shell-shocked was a common term from the time for PTSD, wasn't it? They're a bit shell-shocked. So, I imagine that would have been a really, like, quite potent cultural touchstone for a lot of people at the time.
Yeah, and this stuff is all relative. It's just interesting that they had to kind of pick a specific level for whatever reason. They just felt this was like fantastical enough, but not ridiculous, I guess.
Yeah, and so there's some interesting stuff happening here that would have flown under the radar at the time that now reads a little bit weird.
Oh yeah.
So the idea of Clark Kent presenting as like a wimp or a weakling.
Yeah.
There's a lot of toxic masculinity here.
So I think with that, and that has been around since quite recently. Not toxic masculinity, that's still around, obviously, to an extent. But I think it was appealing at the time, in the 30s way of do you feel powerless in your everyday life? Like, play to the fantasy of, like, but imagine if you were secretly a superhero. And it also, what especially plays into it as a kid who got into superheroes, I think that's a very common thing of, like, if you're not overly popular or, like if you feel a bit isolated in, normal life, to have this fantasy of like, no one here knows I'm secretly a superhero.
Yeah, totally.
And that extends as well to like there's a thing with men and like pretending to be spies.
Yeah.
Like there's a thing, I think there was a Reddit thing where I think some women discovered all like a lot of men. There's the thing recently with the Roman Empire that was like that was a meme for a while.
Yeah.
But on top of that, I think another version of that is most men have imagined being in just some benign situation. They've gone, I think if terrorists suddenly came in through the door, I think I could handle the situation pretty
100%.
well. Like, I would just judo chop and I'd probably do a backflip. Like, you can't do a backflip in normal life. Like,
made a whole fucking video about it.
Oh, Jesus. Should we leave him in? Like, give him any credence?
We'll just bleep his name out like we always do.
Yeah, fuck him. But yeah, I think it plays to that, and this is that 30s version of it, isn't it? Like, are you weak and bad with women? Like, that's the 30s version. Like, well, imagine if you were bloody Superman, you could beat up a bunch of big bad people. So, and that carried through for at least like 50, 60 years after this.
So, just getting into the nuts and bolts of it and the stuff we would normally talk about, because I think that's interesting as a retrospective. Love the artwork.
I really enjoy the artwork.
It's great.
What I find very interesting is like they're not great at depicting darkness when it's outside. Well, they are.
But they didn't have many colors on the printers back then. That's the thing.
They could really only use like black for the background.
Yeah.
But tell you what, they do a better job of depicting darkness in this than the Batman in Detective Comics a year after.
Right.
That one is like broad daylight. It's like in the dead of night, Batman runs to the sea. It's like, what are you on about? And that was a problem up until bloody 80s. Because
Really?
I read a very well-known comic, Death in the Family, and it's the one where Jason Todd Robin gets murdered by the Joker.
Right.
That was from the 80s, and then literally like decades later, in like the noughties, I think, they then brought him back as the Red Hood. But for a while, he was one of those characters like stays dead. Yeah. So I read that 80s comic, and I've mentioned it before. You laugh then, you'll probably laugh again now. It takes place like in Afghanistan or Iraq for some reason.
Talked about
Joker literally steals a nuke.
Yeah.
But so they're literally going across the desert in a Middle Eastern country. I can't remember specifically which one, but they're going across the desert, and it's literally like bright blue sky, like in the background. And it's like in the dead of night, like Batman crosses the desert. So even in the 80s, they still hadn't quite worked out. But in this 1938 Action Comics #1, they do a decent job.
Yeah,
of
no,
shadow.
it looks good.
How did they get it right? And maybe not right, but how did they get it decently in 1938 and then just completely bungle it for like years after?
Yeah, because they use all this cross-hatching, don't they?
Yeah, and fair, it's like a very rudimentary way of doing it, but it does the job.
And do you know what? All the things that I get upset about in modern comic books, like faces looking bad and that kind of stuff, we're working with less detail here. There are fewer lines. They're portraying the face with maybe 5 core lines. You've got a mouth, a bottom lip, a nose, a cheek line, some eyes, and some ears. Like the most rudimentary way to draw a face, but it all looks good.
I think it's really hard to give it a proper justification, like a proper comparison of how good it is for the time.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how good it is for the time, but it looks good. Like it scans really beautifully. And like the backgrounds, where there are backgrounds, are quite nicely rendered. A lot of the time you're just seeing a yellow or orange background or a green background with nothing on it. But when there are backgrounds, they're quite nicely rendered. Like, it looks good.
It looks good for me looking back, but I think I'm getting a lot of that nostalgic, like, wow, first Superman. Like, as a superhero fan, I'm like looking at it with maybe a different eye to someone who's just like likes art and was like, hey, how does this art look? You know?
Yeah, and I'm a dirty casual, aren't I? Let's be honest here.
Yeah.
But again, you know, scrolling through the rest of the stuff in Action Comics 1, it's all much of a muchness. Like, it all looks pretty similar. And so I wouldn't say that, you know, if you were picking up a copy of Action Comics 1 in 1938 and you were just reading it, I don't think Superman would have necessarily popped out that much compared to everything else. But it's also the only property in it that's survived.
Well, one thing I noticed as well, when I did scan through the rest of the comic, just to be like, hey, what generally is this? And one thing I noticed, especially more so in Detective Comics for obvious reasons, but to an extent in Action Comics, most of the people are guys in suits.
Yeah.
Like, that is most of it. So I think in this instance, Superman pops out because he's wearing a bright blue costume with red pants on the outside.
Yeah.
So, and that became a staple of the superhero genre. The outsiders have always been like, why is he wearing his pants on the outside? And there's some art reason for it. I can't remember off the top of my head. There's some like where distinguishing his torso from his legs was an important thing for some reason. But I think he pops out now because you just look at the characters, like he's like nothing you've seen before.
So one of the things that you have to consider really carefully when you're creating a cartoon character, whether this be for still images or for animation, is that you need an interesting silhouette.
Right.
And so that'll probably be where the cape came in, I would argue. The cape is there to add a bit more interest to his silhouette. But yeah, without the red underwear breaking up his legs and his torso, he would just become quite blocky.
I think the main function of the cape, in my opinion, is to add to showing movement. So these were characters, even Batman, who can't fly, he's still like jumping around and he's leaping into like fights and stuff like that. So I think it's dual purpose. It shows his movement, and you can pick that character. Your eye draws to that character because their shape is larger.
Should we talk about Batman?
I think there's a little more in Superman to get
cool.
across. So you're saying about the types of stories. Like, for one thing, we get the sad sack Clark Kent somehow going on a date with Lois when Lois is like, I guess I can't avoid you any longer, kind of thing.
Which is totally the way that courtship happened back then.
Yeah. I do like that Lois is quite an independent woman in this. I was surprised.
Totally.
I thought she was going to be a much watered down, just female love interest.
I mean, she punches that dude in the face.
Exactly. Lois might be one of the original, like, strong female characters in superhero genre.
Yeah.
And I was surprised. I was pleasantly surprised by how, like, much she stood up for herself, and even, like, going on a date with Clark is because she felt sorry for him, and to the extent where they're mid-date and they're mid-dancing, and he literally says to her, why do you always avoid me? It's like, oh, buddy.
Oh, my guy. And, like, you know, to jump forward a little bit, and I think we can do that a little bit before we talk about the modern ones.
Yeah.
They have sexed Clark Kent up for the modern era.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, he is a fucking hunk of a man in a baseball cap.
But he was a hunk in this by 30 standards.
Yeah, I suppose he was. Yeah, I mean, and compared to the other male character models on the page, he's a big dude.
Yeah, he's definitely, he's always been handsome. Like, he's always been the epitome of male physique and, you know, like, perfection.
Although he does look like a man in his mid-70s at points.
But that's the disguise.
That's the art. Yeah, and that's the art style, isn't it?
And there is a fun thing. Like, I haven't read much Superman comics, like barely any, if I'm being honest. I've always kind of tangentially been interested in the character.
Yeah.
But for me, like, when I was growing up and getting into superheroes, for me, he was you've given one character all the superpowers. Yeah. It was like the kid when you were role playing is like, I have all the powers, and you're like, shut up. Like, that to me was what Superman was. I've been enlightened since then, like, what the nuance of the character is, like, in the modern day, like how they've made it more interesting. But one thing I've always enjoyed since understanding about it is the difference between Superman and Clark Kent. Yeah. Intentionally, like, there's always been the thing of, like, how does wearing glasses hide your identity? And the whole point is meant to be, one, if that's the thing you're going to nitpick at in this, where a guy can fly and super strength and everything, like, come on, really?
Yeah.
But it's a contrivance that the fans of superheroes just take because he's so different as Superman compared to Clark Kent. Yeah. Clark Kent is a meek wimp of a man because he has to protect this personal life he has. And it's that personal life that, as you say, later on becoming a god, essentially, that is what grounds him to his humanity.
Yeah, totally.
And it also restrains himself. Like, he has to be that guy who maybe gets into situations and chooses not to use his powers. So the meek Clark Kent, he's like always hunched over when Superman's always standing up. His hair is like more messy and ruffled where Superman's is slicked back.
Yeah.
So all these things, what it's meant to get across is no one would look at Clark Kent and think he could be Superman.
Totally.
What's great, I love as well, is that Lex Luthor, the running thing with him is that for the time he doesn't know, because there's a bunch of times he does know or he finds out, but the lot of time where he doesn't know that Clark Kent is Superman, it's because he grew up with, in some iterations, he grew up with Clark Kent, and he literally cannot reconcile this wimp of a man who he puts himself so many degrees above could ever be Superman.
His arch nemesis.
He just refuses to acknowledge that could even be a thing.
And again, this first iteration, no Lex Luthor, no supervillains. We haven't really come up with the idea of a supervillain yet.
Well, one of the biggest villains, which I mentioned earlier, was going to get into, is the last story, which is a to be continued, is Superman versus a lobbyist.
Yeah.
And I was like, is this how people viewed lobbyists back then?
Well, yeah, and I did. And do you know what? If I'd had more time, I would have done some research on that. But I suppose by the 1930s, there was generally already a sense that tobacco was bad for us. Not in the public eye, but on a scientific level, we kind of knew. And so the tobacco industry would have been lobbying government pretty hard at this point. By the late 30s, early 40s, I feel like the tobacco industry would have already been lobbying.
Do you think maybe the artistic portion of society were more in tune with hey, society and government, you know, and lobbyists, you know, that kind of thing?
I mean, it was around this time that Monopoly was invented. And Monopoly, I don't know if you know much about the inception of the game Monopoly.
It was meant to be a critique of capitalism, wasn't it?
Yeah.
The fact that one person wins over everyone else was meant to be like, this is why the system is bad.
Exactly that. It was created by
Take back the means of production.
Yeah, it was created in 1904. And she revised the game. The woman who created it, Lizzie G. Meiji, revised her patent in 2024. And so, these ideas would have been becoming quite zeitgeisty at the time. And it was essentially a teaching tool to demonstrate two things. One of which is that in a capitalist society, inherently all the wealth will trickle up to one person.
Yeah.
And in a more agrarian socialist society, a game of Monopoly never finishes because everyone just has enough money.
Yep.
And she had 2 rule sets, and it was meant as a teaching tool for economics lectures. And so, this idea that big business was in some way bad would have already been circulating in certain circles. I don't know that it necessarily would have been a prevalent idea among the core audience for these types of comics.
I mean, this is the thing, though. Like, is it the creators who are just like putting their thing in, and this is how kind of ideas disseminated in culture? This is why you had people suddenly rebelling against, like, oh, these kids reading comics these days. It's like, it wasn't because of the violence, it was because of the maybe political leanings of the people who created them, the writers and artists who maybe weren't the most pro-capitalist people.
Because really you start to see that anti-capitalist sentiment gain traction in American culture in the 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
So it's beat poets and then the rock and roll movement and the hippies that really first start to bring these ideas into American culture, where they're saying maybe rampant capitalism isn't good for us as a society. And obviously it's a fairly well accepted idea now.
And then everyone else went, burn them.
Burn them. I want a Smeg refrigerator. Yeah. Because it was the 1950s when American consumer goods became super affordable. Like, it wasn't until post-war that you had a refrigerator in every American household. It wasn't until like the 60s, 70s that became a thing in the UK. Like, Americans had cars and refrigerators and big fucking houses and TV sets and radios as standard by about the 1950s. You like went to work every day and had an okay job, you probably had all those things by that point. Whereas in Britain, people were still had pantries and stuff like that.
We were the opening scenes of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, where there was like 4 grandparents in one bed. That was like Britain at that time, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, Britain still had rationing until the early 60s. Like,
yeah,
Britain continued wartime rationing all the way through the 50s. Whereas in America, it was boom time. People were buying cars, all that kind of jazz. Like, my dad was born in 1967, and he remembers the first house he grew up in not having an indoor toilet.
Jeez.
Like, I am...
Outhouse?
Yeah, literally. Yeah. I mean, we're from Norfolk, and that would have affected it. I imagine if you grew up in London, it might have been a bit different. But in Britain, as a reference point, in Britain, I'm only 1 generation away from not having indoor plumbing. Whereas in America, that would have been like 3 or 4 generations back,
Depending on what class of society you are part of. I think it's an important aspect there. Speaking of the economics of all this, one thing I noticed while I made this note on Superman, so I'm going to say it here. It's about the old comics generally. But the price of 10 cents a comic, like, naturally that's...
Quite expensive.
Well, compared to today, I actually did a little maths on this. So 10 cents for a comic, that is an anthology series. So it makes up a total of 67 pages of comic. And 67 pages that we're just getting of pure, like, story. Like, it's all stories. There's like maybe 1 ad at the end.
Yeah.
So 67 pages of stories for 10 cents. That 10 cents by today's money, so adjusted for inflation.
You adjusted it for inflation.
Adjusted
I like
for
that.
inflation is $2.18. So
that's cheap.
That's half the price of comics going now, which generally are around $4 to $5, somewhere in the middle of those,
and probably about 20 to 30 pages,
like 23 pages of story with a couple of ads in as well. So what by today's standards, comics were very cheap back then.
You're paying twice the much for a third of the content, and a lot of that is advertising.
Exactly. So the reason I did all this, I'm not really making a point, because I acknowledge that I don't know enough to say one way or the other what this means.
We're not economists.
Well, especially we're not publishers of comics. Like, I think that's the main thing. It's like, what is the cost of producing comics in this day and age compared to back then? But one thing I will say is, it does raise the question, like, is the process more expensive? Like, is that the reason? Because if it's not, then some other questions will be raised off that.
I would argue that because of the endearing popularity of comic books, they're now a luxury item. Any kind of printed magazine is now a luxury item, and comic books are now printed to be a bit more sturdy because it is widely acknowledged that they're collector's items now. And so I imagine a modern comic book would be printed on a higher grade of paper stock, because these would have been printed on pulp, wouldn't they? Stopped engaging with me.
Sorry, I was trying to find something. I don't know. Yeah, that's what I mean by I don't know enough to say like what the paper quality is, what the printing press process, whether that affected anything in terms of the price.
As a bibliophile who has also been a librarian in his life, I'm going to call it that based on the yellowing of that paper and the grain texture that I'm seeing on the photographs of the paper, this would have been printed on pulp. I'm calling it that looks like pulp to me.
So the theory might be that the reason they're more expensive is because they are literally made of like stronger materials.
They're made of high quality paper. Paper's more expensive now as well.
Yeah. So, and again, that could be the entire reason, and fair enough. Like if that's the reason, then great.
I would be really interested to see what the pandemic did to the cost of printed comic books.
I mean, the price hasn't changed, but it's definitely changed the popularity of buying physical comics for sure.
Well, because the cost of paper went up particularly in Europe. I don't know what it's like in America. But the cost of paper went through the fucking ceiling because so much of the production had to stop.
Yeah.
And so paper mills could just charge more because it was a more scarce product.
I am surprised that physical comics are still as popular as they are. I'm surprised they haven't moved almost entirely to digital yet. I'm glad. I like being able to go into comic book stores, and I'm glad they're still open and that there's still that physical culture there. I'd be interested to see what the numbers are of like digital versus physical comics.
Yeah, totally. And we've talked about yard boxes and the complications of collecting comics a bunch of times, haven't we?
That is one thing I saw recently. It was like I saw some comic creators kind of arguing and debating why sales were less recently. And I saw a lot of arguments that were like, well, Marvel and DC are churning out a lot more titles than they've ever done before. A lot of them are kind of naff, like they're not that great in quality. And those are points that I agree with.
I bet there's an element of option paralysis in the buying community.
Well, I think people have their stuff that they buy. Like that might be true. I would be inclined to guess maybe not. I was going more of the route of just times are tough right now. Like everyone has less spending money, and comic books are one of the first things that you would cut out if you were tightening the belt. And I didn't see anyone raising that point.
And I think this is the difference, and this is a technological thing, which is that in 1938, maybe your comic books wouldn't be the first thing that you stop buying, in the same way that now your Netflix subscription probably wouldn't be the first thing you would tighten up on.
Yeah.
Whereas comic books have now gone from a primary source of entertainment for a lot of people, which they would have been for a lot of people back in the day. You know, you'd go in the morning, you'd buy a 10-cent comic, and that would be what you sat and read on your lunch break at work or whatever, you know. Or in the evening, you'd sit down with a comic and that would be your evening's entertainment. Whereas now it's like you're blitzing through a 20-page comic in an hour, and it's $5 or £5 or whatever. And it's not a primary source of entertainment. It's not the most affordable bang for your buck entertainment anymore, is it?
Yeah.
Whereas this would have been.
Yeah. And I think as an industry, and this is a large conversation, I think we do need to start moving to more subscription-based models for comics.
Yeah.
The problem is like the leading digital distributor, as we know, is Comixology, which you still have to buy like an issue per issue or an entire volume if that's been released by now. If you want it new, you have to buy issue by issue. There needs to be, and there is like Marvel Unlimited, and DC has their ones where, you know, you can get them. You can get more of a subscription, and I honestly need to look into that because I think it might work out cheaper for us. But I think there needs to be something in terms of like I looked up Image because I didn't know. I thought Image must have some kind of like subscription or something. No, it's literally like digital Comixology, or if you go to their website, it's like here's the nearest comic book shop. And like fair enough, if like trying to support physical comic book shops, I get that. I just don't think it's going to be feasible in the future.
No,
and imagine with Image Comics, if you pay like £10 a month and you got all their new ones. So again, like the streaming services, like you're not paying for each comic individually. You save a lot by having the subscription, and because it's so easy, you get a lot more people who are like £10 a month, and I get like the newest Walking Dead when that was running, and like Invincible, like and everything
all the
else.
back issues,
exactly,
and all of the back issues, because that's where
the library.
That's where it would get me, and that's where it would be infinitely useful for us. is if we had that moment where it was like, oh, we just need to talk about a back issue of something, we wouldn't have to track it down and buy the fucker. We could just go, oh, I bet it'll just be on Comixology or whatever, or on whatever sub-service.
The problem is they're all on Comixology, but it's because they're still charging the physical prices.
Yeah, no, and you need to buy it. What I mean is, if we just needed to dip into a single back issue of something for a reference, with a sub, we could do that, and it would be super affordable and super easy. I know a guy who works in publishing, and he's been trying to do that for the magazine that he works for, and it's really fucking difficult. It's really challenging. Like, just having the server space for all of those high res files, really expensive. It's an expensive thing to do.
Yeah, that's what I say. Marvel and DC have definitely done it. I feel like Image would benefit if they just took all their like hottest titles and you said, if for X amount a month you get all The Walking Dead, all Invincible, all Savage Dragon, all Spawn, like everything that's like all
you don't
Saga.
even need hard drive space because you're in essence streaming it.
Exactly.
Like, you're looking at online files.
And because of the popularity of their biggest titles, like at one point it was mainly just Walking Dead in terms of mainstream like appeal. Now you've got Invincible. Like Invincible is really hot. Like, and that's like, you just point to that and say, I need to double check that Invincible is Image. I'm like 99% certain. I just had that, that
moment,
that feeling in your brain was like, is this actually?
But going back to what I was saying about
Invincible is Image, yes.
Going back to what I was saying about how affordable comics would have been at the time, a standard hardback book in the late 30s would have set you back $2.50, which would have been the equivalent of 40 quid.
So now the average book is like what, £10, give or take?
Hardback is 20. Paperbacks changed publishing.
Yeah, and now that's like 4 individual comic issues.
Yeah, totally. But yeah, so buying a book would have been like buying 20 of these, 25 of them. And so this would have been like like the cheapest written entertainment you could probably get your hands on.
Yeah, and yeah, I think that's a whole wider discussion. Maybe a video, like that could be a good video for the YouTube.
Right, Ryan's fingers again.
My SEO is like, that could be a good one.
So Batman, the Batman title.
Yes,
I'm gonna be honest with you. I felt that the Superman title was far superior.
I think I preferred the Batman one.
I struggled to follow it, man. It was a bit all over the place.
I followed a bit more. So the Batman one, I think, is actually a little more closer to the modern day Batman, which we all get into.
Yeah.
Superman, I was just kind of fascinated. Like I was more like observing it. I felt like I was like, wow, this is different. Batman, I followed it more as like a traditional Batman story.
I enjoyed the Superman one the same way I enjoyed how it's made, which is like, I just took a step back from it and was like, wow, this is a beautiful artifact.
It's like being in a museum. Yeah, you're seeing all the pages on a museum wall and you're like, wow, it's like that. Batman, I felt like I was just reading a story.
Yeah, like I would totally, if somebody said that they'd blown this up and like, got on a really clean like CGC Mint 9 copy and taken high-res scans of it and blown them up and put them on a gallery wall, and you could just walk around a gallery and read this comic, I would go to that exhibition. Like, that would be a really fun exhibit. Like, it was just like an old art piece. And like, when you think of retro Americana and retro American art styles, that is what I think of. Like, it was so synonymous with that style of art. When I got to Batman, I felt that the art was a lot more shaky. Like, I didn't like the art as much in the Batman comic.
I felt, pretty much the same. Like, the art, like I said, the nighttime depiction of Batman was not as good as Superman for some reason.
It was ropey, which is weird because Batman, we think of it now as being inherently darker.
Yes.
And so actually, if you had a modern Batman run where they hadn't really nailed down their low light illustrations, it would just be unreadable, wouldn't it?
Yeah. One thing I did forget to mention just very quickly, which is interesting, was one of the other stories in Superman. So there was one of the other stories which I looked a little into was there was a story about a magician called Zatara.
Yeah.
So that is a current DC character.
No shit.
Not quite a main character. So what happened was they took that character and they gave him a daughter called Zatanna.
Right.
Zatanna is like a main DC superhero.
Oh, wow.
And she's still canonically the daughter of Zatara, and she does the same like magic. She's got the magician get up, but she does like actual magic with reverse talking, so she says it backwards to do spells and stuff. And they are modern day. So I thought that when I was reading, I was like, hang on, I know that. And
so he's not the only one who survived.
No, exactly. Yeah,
that's rad.
Zatara made it. What's now modern day? Zatara is most I've seen. He's the the host of the Dr. Fate character.
Right.
So Dr. Fate is a ancient godlike sorcerer, but he's trapped within a golden helmet.
Yeah.
And the helmet needs to be worn by someone and they become the host.
Cool.
But it's not like a mask thing or like Thor's hammer where you just switch, turn it on and off. The Dr. Fate is literally like, I own your body now for as long as I want. And what they do is they do a thing in Monday where Zatara makes a deal with Dr. Fate where it's like, I'll be your host. You give me like 1 day a year where I can see my daughter, but you use my body for the rest of it. And the reason is because Dr. Fate is such a powerful sorcerer for good. So it's kind of like someone needs to take the bullet here.
The greater good.
Yeah, for the greater good. But someone needs to take the bullet because we need this guy on our team. Like, we need someone. So that was I read that. It was the Leo meme. I was like, I know him, like pointing at the comic. So yeah, just wanted to mention that. Detective Comics, as soon as I read it, I had an inkling of like the reasons for the alter egos, for the aliases for Superman and Batman.
Yeah.
Superman, as we said, was very much are you a wimp? Are you a coward? Well, imagine if you were a superhero.
Yeah.
Batman, I think the entire Bruce Wayne persona was because of the one specific reason of having this twist at the end of this comic.
Yeah, totally.
That was
totally.
It's fascinating to be like, this is going to be a thing for 85 years afterwards.
For reference,
for one M. Night Shyamalan twist.
Bruce Wayne is a young socialite who just happens to be friends with
Jim Gordon.
What's his name? Something Gordon?
Jim Gordon.
He has a title, doesn't
Barbara
he?
Gordon.
Commissioner Gordon. And he just happens to be there smoking his pipe in his like smoking jacket, chatting to Commissioner Gordon, getting all of the secrets that he then needs to go do his vigilante work.
Well, what's especially funny that I made a note of was they're hanging out, and then Jim's like, huh? Well, what's this? A murder? All right, I'll go a murder. Do you want to come with?
Totally.
My young rich friend.
Well, he says,
do you want to see a dead body?
Speaking of exciting stuff, there's been a murder. Do you want to come?
Do you want to have a gander?
And you know what? Like, I bet that shit happened back then.
Unfortunately, yes. Like I made note of it. It's like, that's crazy. It's like, but yeah, probably for the
late
time.
Late 30s. Like, that's how America was governed.
There's barely, there might be no TV or barely any TV. I'm not sure which. Either way, we need some excitement.
I believe TV was possible, but definitely not widespread.
So maybe the socialite Bruce Wayne might have, he'd be like, there's nothing on TV. And Jim was like, what? Like, never mind. Let's go see the body. So yeah, I like that. And then naturally you get this mystery. I felt like being from 85 years in the future, I was like, I know what's happening.
100%. That's how I felt reading it.
I'd love to speak to someone in that time who read that. And I want to be like, did you see that coming? Did you know or did you not know?
Yeah, no.
Were the conventions popular enough? Could you see through the obvious introducing a character, then the reveal at the end?
I had the exact same thought, which was that I know what the fuck moment. But again,
the biggest reveal, the biggest surprise reveal, like of the 30s, like Bruce Wayne is Batman.
I suppose what we have to consider here is the fact that these weren't being read the same way they are now, and Batman wasn't this important character.
Exactly, yeah. But it was still like did it feel like a surprising twist? Like,
yeah, totally.
Because on the one hand, it's like, I can see you've taken like the one character who's not had anything else to do in this story, but was important in the beginning, is then brought back at the end. Like, was that surprising or wasn't it? Yeah,
totally. And like, it was a nice little pullback and reveal. I think it framed the story quite nicely. Again, did not like the way this one looked. I think they fucking nailed Superman's character model in the very first outing. I don't think Batman looks quite right here. And again, in direct, like a real stark comparison, when they revealed Batman in the new one, he looked sick and it was like a full page spread and he looked mean and he looked imposing. And I'm like, oh, they've really, like in the 85 years, they've really gotten Batman right. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, making him the dark vigilante to the bright day of Superman was...
Because again, Batman's story here was less gritty.
Well, I mean, it was a bit darker. Like, there was a serial killer, essentially. Like, with a plot. Like, it was very dark Batman for me.
I suppose it felt like a murder mystery.
Yeah, but then that doesn't mean it couldn't be dark and gritty for the time.
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, it didn't feel particularly gritty to me.
I felt like because it was a serial killer, I thought, for 30s, I thought this was probably quite dark for the time. This was their, I don't know, we're trying to think, what's dark and gritty now? Like, This is like their Hereditary or something.
I was about to say,
or like Halloween.
Just the entire fucking timeline we're living in.
Yeah, that's that, but just in a comic in there. But yeah.
I mean, I suppose it's interesting because the concept of, because they don't use the term serial killer.
No.
Because the idea of the serial killer is a very American invention in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, this is a murder mystery, as you say. I do like that they have the strong detective feel, and that feels redundant, seeing because it is Detective Comics number 27, oddly enough. But I do like that Batman has retained the detective aspect. That is something that got lost in a lot of the earlier films.
Oh, definitely. I mean, we've had one good Detective Batman film.
Which one do you think that is?
Robert Pattinson.
Yeah, I was curious because you haven't seen that one. That's why I was like,
I've
you've seen the trailer.
I don't live under a rock.
Yes.
Like, everybody's come to me and gone, wow, it was such a great detective film.
Yeah.
Enough people say that to me and I go, it's probably a pretty good detective film.
Detective noir especially.
Yeah.
And maybe this was obviously less noir, but I like the detective aspect. And it's why, like, he has the name. He's called, like, the world's greatest detective. Like, he's meant to be, like, the comic version of Sherlock.
I don't know if noir was even codified as a genre at this point.
It probably started with noir films, although there must have been noir books and stories.
No, I think noir is a cinematic term.
That makes sense. It's like the black and white is the key aspect of it, isn't it?
Yeah, 1 minute. I'm just going to double check that.
While you're Googling that, I will say I found the original design with the bat ears on the side to be a bit distracting. I was like, I'm glad they fixed that early on.
Yeah, so film noir is a term that came up in the 1940s and 50s.
Right.
To describe a particular type of Hollywood detective movie. And so this predates all of the conventions of noir.
Okay.
And so I suppose...
Could have been a precursor to it in a way.
Yeah, possibly. But I suppose the idea of Batman as like a noir detective inherently has to have come later. It's a label that has to have been applied to him retrospectively.
It probably came more in the silver age of the 60s. Like,
yeah.
it probably took what was popular and was like, hey, we can make Batman more like that. Not Superman, but we can make Batman that.
The thing with... But Batman in the 60s was camp.
Only the TV show. So the TV show intentionally was made camp because they were trying to appeal to kids and as many people as possible, and they could merchandise and everything and on top of that as well.
Yeah.
Also, TV had really, 60s TV had really strict standards what they could show.
Yeah.
This was back when married couples had 2 separate single beds.
Yeah, totally.
People think generally that used to be the actual way in real life because of that depiction. And it's so crazy to think that everyone was like, of course married people share a bed. Like, that's insane to think otherwise. And some studio executives were like, we should, for purity's sake, we should probably have them in separate single beds.
So sharing a bed was actually not as common among wealthier people.
Yeah, but that's kind of niche, isn't it, compared to the rest of the community you were probably watching? Like 60s television.
I mean pre-60s.
Okay.
So we're talking like 15th, 16th century.
Oh, that's way earlier. Like.
Couples often wouldn't share beds. And it was only really poor people that had to share a bed.
Yeah.
The idea of sharing a bed came in the 19th century when you had industrialized cities where they crammed a lot of people into a small amount of space.
Right.
Suddenly the dwellings had to get smaller, and so you would have a master bedroom where everyone slept.
Right. But I mean, the television viewing audience of the 60s would have been like, why are they doing it like that?
Yeah.
Or they would have known, but it still would have been like, that's weird. I did find it interesting, like you say that this wasn't as great as Superman. I did find that Batman was actually like killing people here, or at least one person. Whereas Superman, I don't think he killed anyone, did he?
No.
He scared people. They thought he was gonna kill them.
And Batman not killing is like a core facet of his character now, isn't it?
And again, another thing that they were like, later on, like, let's add this and that'll be a staple of the character going forward. Probably came about much stronger, again, because of the Silver Age, when the Comics Code Authority was like, you can't do any of this stuff. That was when the Joker, interestingly enough, like, wasn't killing people. I can't remember if this was the comics or the TV show. I think it might have been the animated show in the 90s. But there was a point where, and it's a similar topic, I think it was the TV show where they were like, this is a kid show, you can't show the Joker killing people, obviously. And he'd already been killing people in the golden age of comics. So, and that had been taken away in the silver age, but the golden age was still like, he was a murdering clown. So in the 90s TV show, they were like, all right, we can't have him kill people. What do we do? I know, let's have him make a Joker toxin that puts a permanent, scary smile on people's faces. And it was like,
terrifying.
That's so much worse. great creation by the makers. Like, fantastic work.
It's like the blood in Chinese cartoons, isn't it?
Oh my god.
Let's replace it all with spunk. That's so much better.
And if you want more of that, there's a short on TikTok and YouTube it goes into that a little bit. But yeah, I thought it was interesting. He kills someone by knocking them into the vat of acid.
Yeah.
And again, what's interesting there is they're like, oh, we'll dispose of the body in the acid. That's how we'll get rid of it. And the Batman's like, actually, no, I'm going to punch you into the acid. And I think it's just assumed that the person died in it. But what I thought was fascinating was like the Joker didn't come about till quite a bit after, but that's the Joker's origin. Like specifically in the Alan Moore.
In the Killing Joke.
So that is now a popular one. I wonder if he was influenced by this early original one. Because if not, it's a crazy coincidence, isn't it? Batman #1, Action's 27, Action Detective Comics 27, whatever. But the first Batman, someone gets knocked into acid, and then years later, he has this like one-on-one like antagonist to his protagonist in the Joker, and then decades later, Alan Moore's like, I think he got knocked into a vat of acid.
But we're never told who this bloke is who gets kicked into the acid.
Is he like he's the bad guy or the henchman?
He's a henchman, but he doesn't have a name.
Right.
Could be the Joker.
Could be the Joker, yeah.
Like this is the Joker's origin story from a Killing Joke scene from Batman's perspective.
Oh my god.
Headcanon.
Video idea.
Yeah, right? Oh my god.
No one knows the Joker actually origin happened in 1938.
We could start our own conspiracy.
I'm doing it now. Get out there.
Yep, no, we're calling it. That's what happened.
Yeah. You could retcon it. Be like, that was the Joker.
Totally, yeah.
And
you could totally retcon it.
And that is part of the Joker ethos now. So, yeah, I'm happy with that. But yeah, it's interesting the no-killing thing became a thing later. But at this time, they were just like, yeah, of course he killed someone. Like, it's Detective Comics. People die, I guess. Like, I guess that was the thing at the time.
So, modern day stuff.
One extra little thing I thought you'd like. One of the other comics was a character called the Crimson Avenger, who was another superhero vigilante style character. And I did think, how interesting is it that, like, what's the whole multiverse theory?
Yeah.
There could be, like, a tiniest of action, like a wind change, and Crimson Avenger could have been the Batman.
The huge... Because is Crimson Avenger not still about?
Not that I know of. He might be, but I've not heard of it. If he is, I would suspect it's only because he was in this issue of Action Comics and people are like, ooh, we could do something with this. And
somebody has done a run at some point just because.
But he's definitely not recognized. Like, I recognized Zatara because of his daughter, Zatanna. Like, but yeah, I've not heard of Crimson Avenger. But it's weird to think it's like, it could have so close have been. And especially because Superman was like the cover of Action Comics. So he was big from the start. Batman's on the cover of Action Comics 27, but it's like the 27th issue. It's like this is just
this is just a random thing that we're throwing in for this issue. We'll see if it works, kind of thing.
And initially, I said before about Superman being not the first choice for Action Comics.
Yeah.
Apparently, the reason was they scrambled to get something together because they wanted a strong image for the cover, and the image of Superman carrying the car. They were like, "Oh, this is great." Like, it was the 1930s version of the. We need a great thumbnail for this YouTube video. It's like, we need this front cover, and the Superman one popped and looked interesting. So that's why Superman was in that issue at all.
And super colourful compared to everything else that was happening. There's no blue or red in anything else. It's all quite sepia-toned, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Or black and grey.
So, yeah. Now jumping 85 years into the future.
Your Into the Future voice is suspiciously similar to your Spooky Season voice.
It might just be one character.
That's just the narrator of the podcast.
This guy's kind of an announcer, yeah.
So the first thing that I didn't...
Are we going Batman or Superman?
Let's go Superman.
Okay.
We'll do it chronologically.
So just for anyone who cares, this is the first issue of the 2023 Superman run, which obviously came out this year and was written by Joshua Williamson and artist and cover artist Jamal Campbell. So, new series, the latest Superman. How confused were you?
Well, again, like him taking control of LexCorp didn't make a lot of sense to me, but cool, whatever.
So, Lex Luthor has kind of jumped around between like villain to anti-hero to full-on hero. So he seems to be kind of in that middle ground, which I think has made him a more interesting character these days. He's kind of got a more compass, but I think depending on the iteration, it's sometimes like he's a good guy at heart, and sometimes he's just trying to prove that he's better than Superman, like by saving more people. But yeah, I thought this one was very much it's a first issue of a new series. Let's do something slightly shocking to kind of gauge people, like get them in first. So Superman becoming the head of LexCorp was an interesting thing.
First things first, looks fantastic.
Color is amazing, great contrast.
They nailed it. And it has that very current DC House style to a degree. But I thought the character model for Clark Kent was inspired.
I think it's similar to like the Blue Beetle one we did, the graduation day.
Yeah.
But it's like it pops even more, but it doesn't feel brighter.
Totally.
It's higher contrast without the colors being brighter.
Yeah.
And there's a texture to it, which feels like very warm and doesn't feel as sharp as like other DC comics do.
And Clark Kent looks fantastic in it.
I mean, Superman just looks fantastic. He's got that classic
curl.
Yeah.
But like the baseball cap, glasses, kind of demure in a hoodie thing for Clark Kent, I think is just a great character model choice.
He's a big guy, always hunched over, but like very wimpy.
Yeah, totally. No, they nailed it. Like they knocked it out of the park with the way it looks. The story kind of moved along in a way that I felt was enjoyable.
Yep, I felt like the opening fight, it wasn't overly like and here's Superman and here's what he can do. Like it felt like it I'll tell you what it was. It was that voice that we didn't know who it was. Until I really enjoyed that as an aspect of like, here's something interesting. Because immediately I'm like, who's the voice?
Well, I thought it was Superman's interior monologue until I realized it was Lex.
But then they were like, break her arm. And you're like, wait, what? Like, I thought, who is this? And especially after reading the Batman one, which we'll get into that because I've got some complaints there.
Hot mess in it.
Yeah, it's not great. But yeah, I really enjoyed the Superman one. The splash page with his origin in his cape. I was like, thank you. Like, again, we know these characters' origins. Don't run us through it all. Like a quick, really artistic, like red shadowy splash across his cape. I was like, great.
It was fantastic.
We know it. You've reminded us of it. That's all I needed.
So, Lois Lane.
Again, the most independent woman in all of comics.
Fucking badass. Are we presented with a mixed race Lois Lane here?
Let me...
Because that was my reading of it, just from the way her character model looked.
Yeah, I think she's been given a more ambiguous look, I guess, in terms of race. I know I watched a great TV show, the My Adventures with Superman, which definitely has her definitely not white. Like I'd only be guessing to say what I think they've depicted her as without checking.
Ethnically ambiguous?
Yes, exactly, yeah. And also they gave her a short haircut. And I saw about when it first, like the trailer came out, a lot of like comic threads and forums and stuff were like, oh my God, they've made Lois a sexy tomboy. And I was like, is that the most important thing? Like, fair enough, I understand your excitement, but...
How were people into that?
Yeah, but a lot of people liked it. And I think it's because it had an anime look, which
totally.
I highly recommend if anyone hasn't seen it. Like, I'm not a huge Superman fan. I'm more so after reading this comic.
Right.
But but this cartoon, anime style cartoon, is so good. Like,
because like I would read some of this run.
Yeah, we'll come back to it.
I would probably read this run purely for the art. Like, I liked the way it looked. It looked great. I can't overstate that. The pages scanned beautifully. I was going to talk about the splash page that you just mentioned. That was fabulous. It just all looks great. Super cohesive. Like, huge props to whoever did the line work and the coloring on this, because they knocked it out of the park. It looks fantastic.
So Josh Williamson, I just looked up the writer, because I recognized the name.
Yeah.
He also wrote a very limited 4-issue run of a series called Rogues.
Right.
It was really good. And I literally picked up just being like, oh, what is this? And I knew the Rogues, they're like Flash enemies, and they've always been a bit interesting because they're...
Yes, we've talked about them.
They're enemies who don't kill, intentionally, so it's always a fun because they just do heists and stuff.
Yeah.
And it was meant to be like a one last heist. They come out of retirement and then they're done kind of thing. And the heist is like they're stealing gold from Gorilla City, which is like a race of like highly intelligent gorillas, essentially, who are led by a guy called Gorilla Grodd, a gorilla, who is a powerful telepath. So he can like fuck you up mentally.
Telepathic gorilla.
Exactly.
That's badass.
And he talks.
That's fucking badass.
Yeah. And the run, I literally picked up, I was like, this sounds interesting. And I was like, this is so good. And also, one of the few modern comics I've read from the big two that was aimed at 17 plus had swearing.
Did swears?
Had full swears.
Real swears?
Full swears.
Oh, give me your full swears.
Exactly.
I love it.
So Joshua Williamson, big fan of his work, so no surprise this Superman one's gone great as well.
Was it well received?
I mean, I assume so, based on I've put it this way, when a big title like Batman Superman, when it's going bad, I hear about it immediately, like in the space I'm in. The fact that I've not heard about this, I can only assume it's met the standards they have
that
for
people
Superman.
Expect,
yeah, because Batman Chip Zdarsky, there's running that. There's a lot of complaints there, which we'll get into. And
because to be clear, the only Superman I've read is Alan Moore's annual, the 1985 annual, The Man Who Has Everything.
And that was a good one for his character.
It was excellent. So that was my benchmark for Superman. And I read Action Comics 1 and then read this straight away. Really, like, straight away, I read them Superman, Batman.
Yeah.
So this was my first modern Superman. And I think the thing that kind of interested me was Clark Kent's confidence. We are seeing a more confident Clark Kent here.
Yeah, he's been at it for a bit.
Yeah, and this is the thing, isn't it? We're seeing this is in media res.
It hints that a lot of stuff has happened recently, but it's starting a new story where you don't need any of it. So I think that helps. Like Lex Luthor being in prison, that's no shock, is it? Like he's the big bad. Like that's not a surprise.
Totally made sense. Obviously, that kind of almost collegiate relationship between Lex Luthor and Superman was a bit baffling. But again, I was just able to think, well, this is the status quo that we've reached at this point. This is what DC are doing with it. I'll just run with it. And it was fun to see them not at odds with each other, but not necessarily at odds with each other. And there's this moment where Superman goes, I'm just going to go see him. I don't know what's going on. I'm just going to go see Lex.
Well, he's pissed. He was pissed because of the hologram thing.
Yeah.
So did you get the hologram reference?
No.
So,
I mean, I know the Jor-El head from one of the Superman films from How I Met Your Mother.
Yeah, and that's a core tenet of the modern Superman is he has the Fortress of Solitude, which has a hologram of his dead dad. So his dad, with Kryptonian technology, basically imprinted his entire, basically it's an AI. Like he made an AI of himself, put in, and he was like, you'll help guide my son on this new planet.
I mean, it was cool that when somebody called him Kal-El, I was like, I know who that is. I know that. I get that now. That makes sense to me. Like I knew, like, you know, there was a couple of things that if this had been my first Superman, I'd have been a bit confused by the Kryptonian names and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But obviously going in with the minimal knowledge that I now have, I was like, yeah, this all makes sense. Like this tracks.
And this was great for a number one because you didn't need much beyond the most common Superman knowledge.
Yeah, totally. I mean, again, I'm not a big comic books guy, which is ridiculous and hilarious, given that I sit and do this with you for an hour and a half a week. But I was able to go into this and just read the story for what it was and enjoy it. I think, so the core differences here, and that's part of this video and part of the premise, so I think we should do that.
Part of this podcast.
The power creep was
Yep.
obviously very prevalent. We are seeing a fully powered Superman with 85 years worth of power creep here.
I mean, in terms of like a notable benchmark, in the 80s, in the Infinite Crisis big crossover, he was pulling entire planets to move them.
And so we're not seeing the most overpowered Superman here. I think we're seeing DC having gotten to a point where they've found a nice kind of groove for his powers where he's incredibly powerful and godlike, but not overpowered.
This is a bit of a return to form because what would happen is every time they have like a big DC crossover, he would elevate because Superman would be like, we need the big gun. We need Superman. Like anytime there's a big enemy, it's like, we need Superman. So this brought him back down to almost like Superman's version of street level, which is, I think, like the best way. Because I think that's
pretty cosmic.
It's where you give him more challenges to overcome and things like that. I really love the reason for the voice was, as he said, he attuned his super hearing to instinctively listen for certain people and things. And the two people that get named for that are Bruce, as in Bruce Wayne, and Lex Luthor.
Yeah.
And of course, like the two people who you would in the world who like, I need to hear when they say something significant, I need to know immediately. And also makes sense that Lex Luthor probably realized that really early on and like made ways to safeguard against that. But now he's in prison. He's just like, I'll talk to Superman. So he's just like talking.
He's just fucking with him, isn't he? Which is great.
Well, yeah, it's a clever thing that makes me interested in the story. Where I'm like, is he genuine? Is he genuinely trying to make Superman a more efficient hero, or is there something seedier here? And again, with the whole giving him LexCorp, it's like there's something going on here.
Yeah.
And then, as I said, there's one issue. So there's not that much to say about it, but just it's a nice representation of Superman. I like how he's very like careful with her, boys. Like, you know, like go easy on her. Like taking her to prison. Like be gentle, treat it like a human, that kind of thing.
So is there anything that struck you, having just read the very first iteration, that was different, that you wouldn't have noticed had you not just read Action Comics 1?
The biggest change that I didn't anticipate, that was like a shock or a surprise, was the vibe of the character. So in the 30s one, he's hang on, I'm here to sort things out and to set things straight. Like, that's his thing, isn't it? Like, he's like, hang on, like, I won't let you get away with this. Modern Superman, the modern iteration now, is very much hey, I'm here to help, like, anyone who needs it. Like, I can officiate your wedding if you need it, or I'll save the day and save people's lives, but I'm always smiling and I'm always, like, being the beacon of hope. Like, it's like early on, like, well after the 30s one, the saying was he stands for truth, justice, and the American way. Yeah. Now, obviously, the American way has been a bit co-opted a bit, but truth and justice is like, he's meant to be the aspirational figurehead of those concepts. And I feel it a lot more now here than the 30s first version, where he was just like a kind of like righting wrongs of society.
Yeah.
So very different vibe. Like you say, we can point to all the powers and the setting and everything else. I think the vibe is the most surprising difference. And I think it's the core of everything else.
There's less vigilanteism as well, isn't there?
Yeah, he's a part of society. Like,
yes.
He has and with that feeds into the whole Lex Luthor thing. It's like, we shouldn't be relying on alien gods to defend us whole thing.
Because that first iteration kind of felt more like Batman to me. With
yeah,
the kind
I see what you mean.
Do you know what I mean? That low-level vigilanteism felt like something that has now become more synonymous with someone like Daredevil or Batman.
Yeah, absolutely. I see what you mean.
Whereas, yeah, it felt like the modern Superman had been elevated beyond that.
Also did a better representation of darkness and night, which was probably a significant factor.
Just weird.
Yeah.
Just unusual, wasn't it? So should we talk about Batman?
Yeah.
What a hot mess.
So I'll give you a little bit, very brief, my introduction to this particular run.
Yeah.
This 2016 run, so we are reading issue 139 of a series that started in 2016.
Yeah.
And for one thing, I like long runs like this.
Yeah,
like, I like that there's like a continuity that lasted quite a while. They haven't rebooted in several years. Like, that's great to me. This started being written by one of my favorite writers,
Tom King.
He started this one. A lot of controversy in how he did that. He did the whole Batman-Superman wedding and Batman-Superman wedding, Jesus.
I was about to say, what? What's going on?
Batman-Catwoman one. And he did I love Tom King's style of writing comics. I completely understand why people didn't like his version of Batman. Like, absolutely fair enough. I personally enjoyed it, but I completely get why other people didn't. Then there was a couple of other writers in between then, to then where we are now, or more recently, past year or so, maybe longer, was Chip Zdarsky.
Yeah.
Chip Zdarsky, big fan of his as well. I love his Daredevil run. Like, I'm going to do a video on it at some point. It's really great.
Yeah.
I love he and Matt Fraction did a series called Sex Criminals, which is brilliant as well.
And he also did that Public Domain that we loved.
Public Domain. So he's a great writer. We know this about him. He's not great at Batman.
So did he write this issue?
He wrote this issue, yes.
No shit. That was How is this Chip Zdarsky?
He's just not good at Batman. And I that's why I want to caveat by being, I love all his other work that he does on these other characters and the original works. He just hasn't got Batman in a good way.
Yeah.
So when he first started on this Batman run, he did this storyline called Failsafe, right?
Right.
The point of Failsafe was, it was coming off the back of it was a story called, I think it was called Tower of Babel or Tower of Babel or something. So the point of that was, great Justice League story. Victor Savage, Vandal Savage, is a enemy who, it was actually at the end of this comic. I didn't care about it at all. It was a kind of nothing story. But he's a character who, big, bad in DC. And what he does is, he knows Bruce Wayne is Batman. He breaks into the Batcave and he finds Bruce Wayne's files.
Right.
And the files are how to incapacitate each member of the Justice League. So he takes those plans, gets all of their enemies. He's like, here are plans that we can stop all the Justice League.
Yeah.
And then what he did for Batman was he told Bane that Batman was Bruce Wayne. So Bane just went and caught him off guard as Bruce Wayne. So naturally, Batman, he actually gets buried alive, like with his parents. And and he breaks out
with his fully decomposed parents,
like skeletons by this point. Yeah.
Oh god.
But he breaks out of it, and then he beats Bane, like as he does, and then he's like, right, what the fuck's going on?
Yeah.
And then finds out what's happening to all the other Justice League, and so they help him. He helps them one by one, and they save the day and everything. Come back. But then you get this end where it's really cool, iconic part where the Justice League are like, how can we fucking trust you? Like, you literally had files on us on how to stop us. And he's like, obviously I did. You're the most powerful thing in the world is the Justice League. Like, of course we needed backups for like, or plans in case you went awry. And then one of them goes like, oh, so what's the plan if Batman goes evil or something? Like, what was the plan then? Like, thinking that he would be superior and wouldn't have an answer. And his answer is the Justice League. Yeah. Like, if I go bad, you guys have got to stop me. Like, that's the thing.
Yeah.
And it ends on that with him getting kicked out of the Justice League, but it ends with Superman. So Superman's thing, I don't know if this was the animated movie, which I saw, or the comic, which I read a bit after.
Yeah.
But I think Superman's involved a kryptonite bullet.
Yeah.
And at the end of the animated one, at the very least, he trusts Batman's judgment, so he gives him the kryptonite bullet. He's like, you have this in case I ever do go bad. Like, that's his tacit, like, I'm not saying I'm fully on board, but I get where you're coming from.
I'm on board enough that I'm going to hand you the key.
I see your point enough. So that was a great part.
By the way, Tower of Babel, Bible reference.
Yeah, definitely. It is like a reference for something.
Well, no, it's the Tower of Babel is a biblical story.
Yeah, I'm not sure why they called it that, but
because Babel was this place that had a lot of everybody could understand each other in Babel. So language was a moot point. But there was so much decadence that God saw fit to destroy it, basically.
Yeah, maybe the reference to the Justice League or something. So the reason I bring all that up sounds like a massive tangent, but it is very related because this story that Chip Zdarsky wrote, the failsafe is a robot program that Bruce Wayne made to as a failsafe for if Batman ever goes rogue. Yeah. So immediately, I'm like, why are you backtracking on this great moment from like years before
to do
with something worse?
And also, if Batman went evil, as being Bruce Wayne himself, he would know how to deal with his own robot, right?
So the reason they get around that, which was another criticism I had at the time when I read it, was another part of Bruce Wayne or Batman's consciousness.
I know, which is just fucking dumb.
And that part of him, and this wasn't established when I read it. I just knew it was another part of his consciousness, and that's why he didn't know. Turns out to be that colored costume version of him in this issue.
Right.
So this Batman, and I had to look this up because I actually didn't know this. That part of him is called Batman of Zur-En-Arr. And that name apparently comes from like Bruce Wayne as a kid mishearing his dad's last words before the mugging, which was something like, oh, if he existed today, Zorro would be in Arkham. So it's meant to be a play on that.
Yeah.
This character is from like the 60s. So Chip Zdarsky's brought him back as the explanation of like, here's how this failsafe robot was created. Basically, he's gone off the deep end. I don't like, in terms of like, a big contrived story. I don't think it's gone well. He had one moment where Batman manages to get from space to Earth safely.
It's just a hot mess. Doesn't look great, I would argue.
To be fair, I do think the bigger panels do look good, I thought.
But so bigger Batman panels always look great. And I did already say that the splash panel looked fucking fantastic. Yeah. The reveal splash panel of Batman, kind of half in darkness, you see the suit, it does look fantastic. What I mean is, I wasn't as much of a fan of the visual language of the whole thing.
Yeah, it was a lot kind of darker and not as interesting looking. It was a kind of like pencil drawn look.
Yeah.
Which I'm fine with, I guess. It didn't really pop out to me. It didn't help that I wasn't enjoying the story as much.
Well, yeah, and I suppose this is the thing, isn't it? We've established that this happens to both of us. When we're not enjoying a story, we kind of, But like, there's moments like this where that just isn't a great piece of art.
No. I think the main thing we should look at now, because we didn't enjoy the story as much, is like your question, what are the biggest differences between this modern Batman and the 38 one? I think one of there's big differences in terms of everything the Batman is nowadays. So he's obviously darker, he's in the shadows, he's got a strict moral code. I think the key thing with this very modern day, like as of like this last decade or so, there's a bigger focus on the psychology of Batman.
Yeah, and I suppose that is part of the evolution. There's also they've really leaned deeply into this idea of the Joker as Nemesis.
Yeah.
For people not watching this as a visual podcast, because it isn't one, I'm pointing at a panel where they've inset a panel which is half of Batman's face, half of the Joker's face.
Yeah.
And so they're really leaning into that idea that has existed in Batman for a long time now, where the Joker is his opposite number. And obviously that just wasn't present initially. That's something that's evolved through time and the Joker becoming such a prominent Batman villain, right?
So I would say from the 60s, maybe not even till maybe like the 80s or 90s, I think the Joker has always been just one of his enemies for that time.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until way later when I think the Joker became such a popular character. And also, for the longest time, they didn't give him a backstory compared to everyone else. I think that was just by happenstance. I think they were like, oh, he's actually a lot more mysterious because we haven't given him. Maybe it was because him as just a homicidal clown with no origin was just interesting in itself.
The initial big Batman villains were Penguin, weren't they? Penguin was a big one.
Riddler,
Penguin, people like that. The one piece of art that I did really love in this, and I've just found it for you, is that splash panel.
I was going to say about that.
But
that's because of the context.
But it's fantastically well rendered. Like, from that, I get a real sense of 1960s Batman.
Yeah,
like,
and that's because they are all different versions of them.
Yeah, no, they're all so nailed on. They all every single one of them looks fantastic, and they've taken about 10 distinct art styles and made them all work in one big splash panel together.
There's some that I can name. So the whole point of this is that there's even more Batman personalities in his mind. So I'm not big on that context. But in terms of the types of Batman they have here, so jumping out the top, they've got Dark Knight Returns, Frank Miller Batman, with the big bat on the chest. Then you've got 60s cartoon Batman. You've got 90s animated Batman on the right. This put together one, I don't know. There's the Val Kilmer Batman, it looks like.
Yeah.
It looks like Val Kilmer under it. And then you've got a 60s Adam West.
Is that Adam West?
I think so, yeah. With the one ear kind of falling a bit because the costume wasn't great for like keeping him up.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's great, but yeah, definitely a highlight of a not great current run, which again is a shame because I keep coming back. Chip Zdarsky, I really like it.
Yeah, no, totally. And like, I've not read anything. I didn't clock that this was written by Chip Zdarsky, which says a lot because I hold him in really high esteem, thanks to public domain.
And this is just one of those areas that, like, again, not every writer nails every run of a superhero they do, and that's fair enough. So, and Batman is a difficult one because the standards are so high, not necessarily because of how good the comics are normally, but because of the peaks that people remember, like the Killing Joke, The Long Halloween, the Year One, and Dark Knight Returns. People think of those and they think, oh, every current run should be as good as those, and they're just not. Like it's
they're never gonna get there.
Well, I mean, very rarely they do sometimes, and I think that is what keeps people going. For me, it was the Tom King run, which again is not popular choice, but everyone has those.
Is that not held in very high esteem then?
Some people really just don't like Tom King's style, and it is a distinct style.
And we've talked about this a lot, haven't we?
Yeah, I love it, but I understand why people don't. And he did write the best Batman story, which was that issue of Human Target where Batman's not in it.
Oh, that was so good.
So good.
So yeah, and I suppose this is the other thing, is that within the DC comic book universe, there is this sense of omniscience around Batman. Like, he's all-knowing, all-seeing. Whereas, obviously, that is something that's developed over time, and so we're not seeing that in this early Batman run.
So there's an interesting thing with Batman where he's a lot more all-powerful, all-knowing, seemingly.
Omniscient,
Yeah, when he's in a big crossover thing.
Yeah.
When he's in that, he's like, oh, he could take on Superman. Like, he's that level. As soon as he's back down to his own stories, he gets a lot more like, someone's been murdered, I need to figure out who did it. Like, it's that. So, like, the Batman from the Justice League would almost be like, I know immediately who did it. I knew who did it before they did it, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Whereas when he's back down to, it goes from like street level to cosmic level.
Yeah, I suppose Batman is seen as an unstoppable force when he's in an ensemble, but if they did that in his own stuff, it would become boring, wouldn't it? So there needs to be some challenge. There needs to be some more limits to his power.
I think the problem with that is because he is their like figurehead, basically, like along with Superman. When they do a big thing, a big cosmic crossover, it's like, well, Superman's there, obviously. Wonder Woman's there. She can hold her own. Flash is like a god in his own right. We have to get Batman in there somehow. So then he becomes the all-knowing, insanely intelligent, that becomes his superpower. But then they have to tone that down again when he's then street level, because, like you say, it'd be boring.
What's interesting here is that we are presented with a very modern standard Bruce Wayne, but Bruce Wayne of the original comic was like this kind of prancing socialite in his dinner jacket, smoking his pipe. And I feel like a certain element of that has been lost over the years. And Bruce Wayne, what I'm maybe suggesting is that there were some subtle changes to Clark Kent's character which modernized him a little bit. Bruce Wayne is just completely different here.
Yeah, well, in this, more recently, he's not a billionaire right now.
Oh, what happened?
There was a big Joker war thing, and the Joker, knowing he was Bruce Wayne, was managed to steal all his money, basically.
But Bruce Wayne's power is directly linked to his money, isn't it?
Exactly, and that was like an interesting direction to take him in. He has had to be Batman with limited resources.
Yeah.
So it's definitely made it more interesting in some ways, but it does also, for me, like I see these waves as like, we do an interesting thing for a while, then we go back and, like the tide's turning every once in a while. So for me, I love
the idea of Bruce Wayne turning up to be Batman in like a Hyundai.
Yeah. He had to get a taxi.
Yeah, like he couldn't quite afford an Uber, so he had to get a lift.
Yeah. I had to get a Bat Uber.
A Batuba.
A Batuba, yes.
I got a Batuba.
So I think that's pretty much what we get for the modern ones, but it's still an interesting road to go down. I think we got a lot more of the old ones because there's so much difference.
They were fascinating, weren't they?
Yeah, I think what'd be good at some point is if we take like one from the 40s and then the 50s and the 60s and just see how that kind of goes.
Totally. I'd love to do some Golden Age Iron Man.
Yeah, that first one is really interesting.
I'd love to do some early like Iron Man when he was either in the Korean War or the World War II as opposed to the Iraq War.
Yeah, I think so.
Was he in Nam?
I don't think he was in Vietnam. I don't know where originally his accent happened. I know Punisher was originally Vietnam.
Yeah.
And they updated him to like Afghanistan and Iraq.
But no, I've been saying I want to do some older stuff for a while, haven't I? And I think
we should both probably do Spider-Man next.
Yeah, I think we've done a bit of old Spider-Man because we talked a lot about John Romita Senior, didn't we?
Yeah, but if we do like really early on, like first writing, because he was an established character when Romita Senior took him over.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, I've been thinking about doing some older stuff for a while, and I think the general sense that we both have is that it's the most interesting for us when we talk about stuff that's currently releasing, right?
Yeah.
Because, it just feels a bit more worthy.
The current zeitgeist of comics.
Yeah, totally. And that's like totally valid, isn't it? But actually reading stuff that's like 85 years old, I mean, I still, my conception of where we are in time is still rooted in the 90s.
Yeah.
And so in my head, something
as
that
90s
happened,
kids, yeah.
Yeah, something that happened 85 years ago happened pre-World War One. Actually, Batman is nearly 100 years old. Batman is nearly as old as The Great Gatsby. That blows my mind a little bit. And so the idea of actually taking a look at the early inception of a few of these characters would be really interesting. We touched on it with Thor when we did a whole deep dive into Thor. We've now touched on it with Batman and Superman. I think it would be interesting to talk about some early Marvel. Of course, that becomes a bit more difficult because the whole Stan Lee not actually having created some of what he says he created thing.
Well, that'd be an interesting part of it, won't it?
It would have to be part of the discussion, wouldn't it?
Yeah. But yeah, I think that's pretty much all we've got for this one. I think it was interesting that doing two superheroes now of this format, it's gotten us nearly 2 hours, definitely well over an hour and a half. So definitely maybe like one superhero retrospective
maybe bit off
next
more
time.
Than we could chew.
Yeah, and we took the biggest one. So
I feel like we've talked a lot more about Superman as well because we just both enjoyed both of the Superman comics more, right?
Well, Superman has been kind of underrepresented a bit in very recent years, but he's going to be big again because James Gunn is doing Superman Legacy in a few years.
And we've talked more about Supergirl on this podcast than we have Superman.
Yep, because she had a great run by Tom King.
Yeah, no, it was fantastic.
They are using that as the basis for a Supergirl film in the reboot of the DC. Yeah. So we do it again. We just do the same one again. Yeah.
I really liked that comic book.
Yeah.
The narration was so good.
Yeah. And I think the DC reboot, helmed by James Gunn, is going to be great. It's going to give us a lot to cover, I think, for that.
Totally.
So, yeah, do you want to take us out?
Thank you so much for listening. If you want to watch some shorts, we make them on YouTube and TikTok. I don't need to tell you where anymore. It's just the Comic Literate Podcast. You want to send us an email, comicliterapodcast@gmail.com.
Comic Literate app podcast or?
comicliterapodcast@gmail.com.
I think it's just comicliterate@gmail.com.
comicliterate@gmail.com. He was right. That's annoying. Reviews 5-star wherever the fuck you get your podcast from. Just make it a good one. I don't care what you say as long as it's 5 stars, baby.
And we will read it out.
And we will absolutely read it out.
We should probably stop saying that because we haven't had a 5-star review yet. So.
Don't tell them that.
We haven't read any out yet.
As always, big thank you to the Comic Literate resident historian who wants to remain unnamed. Thank you so much for listening and good night.
Thank you. Goodbye.